That's wonderful. So tell me, how did learning about and then implementing eventually UDL, how did that affect your instruction, or even more broadly, your feelings about teaching and learning? Did it have any effect?
Okay, so I feel like there were two major impacts for me. The first has to do with trusting my students. So in the beginning, letting go of control over where students were sitting and who they were going to work with and what they were going to turn in as their final assessment. Letting go of that was a real challenge for me. And it's not that I didn't want students to have control, it's that sometimes when you give students control, they go a little wild. So I was worried that they would, you know, be chatting instead of working. And so it was a process for me to learn to trust them. And I'm really glad I did, because I feel like it strengthened my relationships with my students when they understood that I trusted them to know what they needed to do in order to learn the material. Then they responded by actually learning the material or taking the steps they needed to make sure they learned it. And it allowed us to have conversations about natural consequences. For example, you know, this is an opportunity they have for this year to learn, and if they don't want to take advantage of it, they'll have other opportunities down the road, but this one won't come around again. And so once they understand the importance of learning in this class in this year, then I feel like they respond really well to it. I really love that it gave me a chance to be more intentional about how I support my students. So in the past, I feel like I did offer a lot of support, but I didn't plan it out in a way that I could point to it and say, I am offering this particular support for this lesson. So I feel like those are the ways that it impacted me the most.
Yeah, I want to go off of what Lois said about the relationships that we built with our students, because I think it says a lot that you give the students the opportunity to make their own choices and that you're looking out for their best interest in their learning. And they see that when you give them multiple choices and the different ways that they can go about learning in their own way. I would say also specifically, I teach a class that's a split class, so I have 3 separate sections of math in the same room: Algebra 2, Honors Geometry, and Intro to Geometry. So when I'm in that room teaching all those different classes at the exact same time, I have to do these different accommodations and stuff like that. And it's specifically really helped in that room because students are in charge of their own learning. And it frees me up a lot more to be able to help around the room where needed as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like parenting, you know, at least for me, that's how I approach it. I mean, I can, you know, you can teach your kids what you want them to do, but ultimately you have to let go because they have to make choices for themselves. And our 8th grade students, they're 14 years old, you know, they're 4 years away from being able to vote and manage their own lives independent of parents and teachers. So the more that we can begin to trust them with managing their own education now, the better off they'll be for it down the road.
Yeah, and I do see them being more responsible in their learning and their materials and their homework and stuff like that. And I know that that's helping them to be more successful later on.
Yeah. And I feel like we're a safe place for them too, because they can fail with their choices in our classes, and they know that we care about them and we're going to help them get back on track. So it's, you know, before high school, before college, it's really helpful for them to make a choice and fail and make a different choice and learn that process on their own.
Yeah. Like sometimes I've realized that they'll make choices based on what their friends are doing or what they think, you know, is going to be the easiest choice, and then it might not be what works best for them, and that gives them the opportunity to learn that, and then they do think more about what the decision, why they're making those decisions.
And also, I think that it helps to separate us from their education in the sense that they're not letting us down when they make a bad choice, and we're not mad at them.
Right.
So if they choose not to do an assignment, that's not about me, right? It's about them. And so we're able to have personal, one-on-one, calm conversations with students where we can ask them things like, you know, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? And the choices you're making right now, are they going to lead you to that goal or lead you away from it? And, you know, what can I do to support you? So you're not getting your work done. How can I help you get it done? And instead of just, you know, them feeling uncomfortable about approaching us because they're worried that we'll be mad.
What can we do to help you succeed? The conversation has changed.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And the ultimate goal of UDL is really to get students to that level of independence and autonomy. And if you look at the actual framework itself, at the very bottom, there are three little pieces of information. It says that we want our students to be purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal directed. And that is the goal of the entire framework of UDL. So I like that you all have started to see that a little bit. Let's end up with this last question, because I think this will be interesting to hear as well. So now that you all have kind of had the experience where you've learned a little bit about UDL, you're using it in your classrooms, I think you all have even sort of taken it on yourselves to be leaders within your school for UDL. What advice would you give, or are you giving, what advice would you give to teachers who are just starting out with UDL?
I would say that it's going to take a lot of adjustment, and you have to be patient, because not everything that you try is going to work with your students or what you would like to see in your classroom. So for me, it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of this works, this does not, a lot of reflection on how I could make it better and still work for the students and for me and get done what I needed to get done.
Yeah, I agree with Shelby's advice to be patient. So you don't have to make great big changes all at once. And, you know, you don't have to see these immediate and huge transformations. You can make small changes and see slow transformations. And that has a lot of meaning. I mean, it's, you know, that's true in all aspects of life. And then also I would just say to trust your students, which is really hard. And it's the advice I had to give myself over and over.
And I'd say on that same note, you know, it's when you're going to trust your students, you've got to listen to them as well. You know, they'll give you feedback about the changes that you're giving in class, and it's really good to take that because it is their education, and they want to help you get better as well.
Yeah, in fact, last year, a student that I adore told me one day that the kids were misbehaving because my class was boring. And it was really, really awful to hear. I mean, now that student and I can joke about it, but it was also important for me to hear. And so I feel like being open to hearing feedback that you might not want to hear will ultimately make you so much better. And then my last piece of advice would be to find a friend that you can work with and talk to, because Shelby and I are able to have so many conversations about what we're doing in our classes, math and language arts, and about the students we have in common and how we can support them and help to create a school atmosphere that's affirming and uplifting and a place where we want to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, like, when we've been working together, it's amazing how much overlap there is, even though we're in two completely different subject areas, just in the way that we can, like, make accommodations and work with our students.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of the skills that students will learn as a result of UDL are transferable. So if they learn how to break things down into chunks in Ms. Sepabon's class, they can carry that over to when they're working on their algebra in Ms. Cameron's class. So I think that's pretty amazing. Well, I want to thank you all both for being with us today. I hope you'll stick around. We'll have a question and answer at the end, and we may have some questions that are specifically for teachers. So if you're able, please hang around and join us for the rest.
Yeah, we'll be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to minimize you right now. Okay. Oh, they totally went away. Okay, well, let's move on. So looking at UDL in higher ed. So part of what we do at CELT, are we muted? Okay. Part of what we do at CELT is that we work with individual instructors, and often it's instructors who come to us asking for help. So we can go in and do a mid-semester feedback where we're asking for student voice in the middle of the semester as opposed to waiting at the end of the semester when it's almost too late to make changes for that student. And when we do that, we are also able to sit down with the instructor and find out what are the areas they feel like they're struggling with. Like what are the areas, what are the problems of practice that you are seeing in the classroom and how can we help with that? So I wanted to give a couple of examples of suggestions that we may have made that are UDL related and ways that if someone is listening in the conversation today who is at a university or college, that this is something that you might be able to share with your faculty as well. So talking specifically about assignments, one of the things that UDL is really big on is student choice, student voice, but also student choice. So giving students choices as often as possible. In K-12, sometimes it can come down to like literally you can use a gel pen or you can use a marker today. And that's a choice. And although that seems silly and trivial, like that can be the difference between a student writing 10 words and a student writing 40 words. So being able to give students choices as much as possible. So at the university setting, that might be something like letting them choose a topic for a paper. Here's the general topic. Now you're going to find a topic that makes sense for you within that topic, right? So if we're talking about, I don't know, maybe the Civil War, what is something that would be really interesting to you about the Civil War? Well, maybe I'm someone who really likes fashion, and I might want to look at the fashion that was around that same time period, and what did that have to do with the Civil War, and how, was it difficult to get fabric? So finding a way for the students to make that emotional connection really gets to their affective networks in their brain and helps to really raise that engagement. Another way to choose is to give students choices is how to be assessed, right? It doesn't have to all be tests or papers. That's often what it is in the university setting, but it doesn't have to be. And there are a lot of folks who have really opened up and allowed students to choose how they want to show what they know, how they want to demonstrate what they have learned. And when they give them that option, they're blown away by the results. There's some really great pieces that our students are doing out there when we are not tying them down so much by only giving them tests and papers to respond. And then another very simple way to let students choose is to let them choose if they want to work as an individual, if they want to work as partners, or if they want to work in a group. There are a lot of students out there, especially at our universities, who in their high school, when they worked in a group, they were the one kid that did all the work. I know a couple of those myself. They live in my home with me, and they're the ones that do all the work in the group, and they hate group projects because they do all the work. And so being able to give students that option in a classroom setting at a university is going to be really helpful as far as raising engagement. And so at the bottom here, I just wanted to indicate what UDL checkpoint that might relate to. And so you can see that it's 7.1, which is under engagement, which is why I use the green. I was color coding there, but 7.1, and that's part of recruiting interest. And how can we help students to recruit interest? One of the ways is that we can optimize individual choice and autonomy. Reading. So one of the biggest complaints that we get from faculty is that students are not doing the readings. Like they'll show up to class, but they're not doing the readings. And so I have to go back over everything that we've done in class, or that they should have done at home. Now we have to do it again in class. And so some of the things that we suggest are very simple and really won't have an effect necessarily on their curriculum. So this is one of the simplest things I think that can be done at a university level to really help students with their planning and strategy development. And that is to simply estimate the amount of time it takes to read something. So I'm teaching a course right now, and it's actually about UDL. And so I have brought this book. I don't know if, I think the camera's up there. If you can see it, it's a great book. This is by Louis Lord Nelson, and it's called Design and Deliver. It's an excellent book if you are looking for some extended learning about UDL. I would highly suggest this book. But so I assigned some chapters to read, and I sat down and read them myself. And so after I'd sat down and read them myself, I mean, I've already read them before, but I read them again, and I timed myself. And then typically what is suggested is that you multiply that by 1.5. And so that would be the amount of time it would take students possibly to read that, right? So all I have to do for this particular change is next to the reading assignment in my syllabus, I just put the estimated reading time, the ERT, that's it. estimated reading time. So what that does is students who are pressed for time, a lot of our online learners are very pressed for time, and a lot of them have families, a lot of them have jobs, and so they don't have 2 or 3 hours that they can sit down in a day and do work. But they might have 15 minutes where they're waiting outside of their daughter's ballet class for their, picking up their kids. And so if they've got a list of reading selections and they see that one is 15 minutes, and okay, well, I can fit that one in right now. Whereas if I just sit down and go, okay, chapter 12, all right, well, I don't know how long this is going to take me. It really gives them some great support as far as planning and strategy development. And so you can see down there at the bottom, this is related to checkpoint 6.2, executive functions, and that's under action and expression. And executive functions is a huge area that is a huge area of need in all school settings. So finally, the lecture, the college lecture. One of the ways that I think lectures have gotten a really bad rap in education, and lectures are not the worst, but lectures can be the worst. And so there are ways, of course, that you can just make very small adjustments to your lecturing so that students are staying engaged. And so one of the ways to do that is to use, I've heard it called Think, Pair, Share before, but I had an instructor at one point that called it Think, Ink, Pair, Share. And I really like that because I am not really a talker. Like, I'm not the kid in class that raises my hand, because I just need a little extra time to process that. And so whenever I have a Think, Ink, Pair, Share, so first I think about the answer. Number 2, I write it down. I kind of just jot down some notes, and then now I'm going to talk to somebody about it, and then we share out as a big group. So this is something very simple that could be implemented in a college setting, in a college classroom. And so when we're doing that, and we're giving students that option, we're giving them 2 things. One, we're giving them alternatives for auditory information. That's checkpoint 1.2 under representation, which is perception. So we're saying, okay, I realize I'm just standing here and talking to you for a long period of time. Let's mix that up a little bit. So you're going to have an opportunity to reflect on it. You're going to have an opportunity to jot it down. You're going to have an opportunity to talk to one person about it, and then maybe we'll share out as a group, right? So it's sort of building that scaffolding along with it. And also checkpoint 4.1, which is physical action. That's under action and expression. I'm giving them another way to respond other than raising their hand in class, right? So as a student, I'm still talking with my neighbor about it. I'm still writing it down. I'm still working with the content in that way, but it's more active as opposed to passive. So those are just some very simple examples of ways that we are making suggestions itself for faculty to really start implementing UDL and start building that into their courses. Okay, so we're going to go to Allison Posey next. Allison is, her kiddos are on spring break right now. And so she was kind enough to put together a quick video for us. Allison is an expert on how the brain works in learning. And we're going to go to her video real quick. And she's going to tell us all about it. So there she is up in the little corner.
Hi, my name is Allison Posey. Thank you for joining me for a quick overview of learning in the brain, a UDL approach. If you need to access the slides, feel free to use this tiny URL or the QR code. My name is Allison Posey. As I mentioned, oh, there we go. I'm a curriculum and design specialist at CAST, which is here in Wakefield, Massachusetts. And we think deeply about how to use the UDL guidelines as a tool to design learning experiences that meet the needs of all students. But my background is in mind, brain, and education, so I work really hard to make the connection between neuroscience and our classroom practices, and I see UDL as a fabulous translation tool between the 2 fields. So our goals for today are to just do a quick overview to deepen understanding of learning in the brain, to explore UDL guidelines as a tool to design for learner variability, and hopefully to offer you some application to practice ideas. And I invite you to pause the video at any time to reflect on your own goals or to have additional conversations. So there are 5 key ideas that I want to talk about in terms of learning in the brain. First, that there's an interaction of the individual in the environment. There's incredible variability. The brain has unbelievable plasticity, more than we ever imagined. Our experiences really matter, and emotions are at the core of learning. So again, feel free to pause here and reflect on what you think of when you think of what learning is. How do you define learning? How do you look for evidence of learning? and to think about how those connections relate to what I'm sharing about the brain. So first, I'd like to start with this picture because it was drawn in, or representative of thinking in the 17th century. The idea was that there's a little teeny tiny homunculus or little mini human being inside every single sperm. And basically over time, that human just grows. And in fact, we know now that this is not at all how learning or any kind of development happens. Learning is this incredible interaction of an individual in the environment. And one of the pieces I think in education we don't often think enough about, or I'm going to argue that we don't often think about enough, is the role of the environment in that learning. And UDL is going to really challenge us to think about how there are barriers in the learning environment, and not to think about the barriers being in the student or the learner themselves. So we're not thinking about our students as a little mini homunculus who's just growing and their brains are what they are. But instead, we're going to think about their learning in their brain as developing in an interaction in the environments that we're creating for them. So we know that we have this slow neurodevelopment over time, and this leads to some of the tremendous variability or just differences, a full range of our brains. And it's really actually very important that our brains develop this way, because then we're able to construct brains that are appropriate to our environment. So if you see on this image here, the gray matter, the actual neurons of the brain, aren't fully formed until through our 20s. The brain is actively developing and changing. And we actually, adults, have over 700 new neurons every day that are built. So we are constantly growing our brain. And you might say, well, why would this be? It seems like a really bad idea that it takes so long to actually develop a brain. And there is an evolutionary trade-off to it. So brains can actually manage more complex reasoning, communications, and social interactions that are appropriate to different environments. So if you start thinking about the different places your students have come from, their different environments, their different countries, their different cultures, all of that they're bringing to your classrooms, and especially by higher ed, students have had decades of experiences in classrooms, in social settings. Their brains have co-constructed based on the interactions that they've had in those environments. So, what we're seeing now is this old view of the brain as being fixed, like having these, set areas, or here's even from a, fairly recent scientific journal that said, dyslexic brain, spot right here where something's different, and quote unquote normal brain, which I hate, is here. In fact, we see that it's not like that at all. There's actually tremendous interconnectivity of brain networks. All of our brain is active. I'm hoping my little demo here will kick on for you to be able to see just how active the brain is, even when it's just reading the simple word like dog, D-O-G. So I'm going to go ahead and just launch this video so you can see just how interactive they're in a brain scanner and doing nothing but reading naturally 3 letters D-O-G.
Look at those waves in order to see what the brain's doing.
And you'll see
and which areas of the brain are connected to each other as somebody does something or perceives something. So the word dog flashes on the screen. What should happen in the brain according to the traditional analysis? The first thing would be that the back of the brain would light up, and then the language areas of the brain would light up. What actually happens is exquisite. It's so much more complicated than that. We see the back of the brain light up first, and then the whole brain gets involved in a rich symphony of activity. It actually.
So I hope that helps really highlight just how interconnected and active our brains are. We don't have just right or left hemisphere. We're not right brain or left brain. We're not isolated learning styles. But even something as simple as reading the word dog activates so many networks of the brain. And we can see from, these are called diffuser tensor imaging, where you're able to see the white matter tracks of how neurons connect. And they're so complicated, and they change so quickly. So just in the matter of days, neurons, for example, that are devoted to visual cortex, if you start using your fingers a lot, let's say you're playing an instrument a lot with your eyes closed, you're going to start to see shifting in just a matter of days of parts of your visual cortex being devoted to tactile touch. So we're able to really impact and influence the networks, the connectivity between brain networks. And I think that's really exciting for educators, because based on how our students are interacting in our classrooms, we're literally able to sculpt and influence structures in their brain. So I think that's empowering. So I just want to pause there for a moment and give you a chance to reflect so far on how you think some of this brain science could apply to your teaching, thinking deeply about how learning is that interaction of the individual with the environment. We're not a little fixed homunculus. Thinking about that variability that you saw and seeing how quickly, understanding how quickly the brain can change. So feel free to pause the video, reflect, think, brainstorm together, and we'll pick right up. So again, I think we often teach to this old model of learning too. We used to think that there was sensory information that comes in, like we see a cup of water, and that information gets transmitted to the brain. And we didn't know, we used to not know a whole lot about the brain. It was kind of this black box, this mystery box, and we would see that a motor action comes out, so some response. So I think our teaching was largely, we need to present stimuli to our students, and then they will produce motor outputs for us. And again, like I was sharing before, I actually think it's so much more complicated. Our experiences drive our perception. So this is one of my favorite examples from the nervous system that shows that our expectations literally fill in what we want to see based on our past experiences. So it should be when we look out into our visual field, we actually should see blood vessels that are, covering our vision, but we don't see those because they don't change, they lack meaning. Our brain says they're not important and literally ignores it. So I don't know if any of you, probably none of you see those blood vessels in front of your eyes. We also should have a blind spot where the optic nerve leaves the eye. We have no photoreceptors. So all of us should see two blind spots, one on the right, one on the left. And my guess is you don't, because what our brain does is it fills in what it expects to see there. And I just think that this is a marvelous example of how the nervous system and our previous experiences and expectations literally drive what we perceive at the level of perception. So again, you might start thinking about what are students expecting to see in their class? What have been their previous learning experiences in history, math, science, whatever it may be, public speaking, and how are they filling in? How are their perceptions and expectations filling in and literally changing what they perceive? And this brings me to my last point, and that's that we really know ultimately that emotions drive learning. And research has found, if you look at people who have sustained damage to emotion centers, it's the learning that's compromised. So emotions are not these annoying kids in the china shop knocking off the cognitive glassware is the analogy. But in fact, emotions are like the shells that hold up cognition. So I think that can be really, and to continue with that, emotion is actually so central that if you're having a negative day, if you're not feeling very good, then you literally perceive the slope of an incline or the height of a balcony as being different than on days when you're feeling good. So again, we just can start to think about, what are like the tigers in our classroom? What's driving students' physiology to be, in a heightened state? So maybe you cold call students, and for some students that's okay. For others, that emotional element could be a trigger, sends their sympathetic nervous system, their fight or flight system into full, stress mode, and really impacts what they're perceiving and how they're learning in your classrooms. So I've just, again, kind of shared some big topics potentially for our classrooms and thinking about our, how our students are learning. So feel free to pause here and think about how experience really matters and how emotions are at the core of that. And this is where I think universal design for learning can really be a powerful framework for us to really think deeply about how we're designing our environments so that the interactions of the individual can really be positive for learning. It helps us anticipate variability, anticipate the full range. We can think about variability in terms of each of the UDL guidelines. We know there'll be variability in our students' executive functions for how they plan and monitor their progress as they work on our assignments. We know there'll be variability in their language and how they sustain effort and persistence. So UDL gives us a language for anticipating variability, and it gives us design suggestions. So each of these little checkpoints is a design strategy. So if you're thinking about the range of executive functions as you're planning, maybe a long-term writing assignment for your students, you can think about how you're supporting them to, set appropriate goals. And what are you doing to plan their strategies that they're developing and to help them monitor their progress along the way. We know that the brain can change, and so doing these strategies is not dumbing it down, but is in fact building and sculpting brains to become more purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-directed. So that we're really designing experiences that put engagement first. As you can see, the UDL engagement principle is first, and we hope that those emotions are at the core. So to implement UDL, the first thing you have to do is know your goal, because otherwise the UDL guidelines just seem like the grocery store. If you don't know what you're shopping for and you go into the grocery store, you just have choices everywhere and you don't know what to buy. But if you know your goal, if you're really targeting, I'm buying something for the hockey team dinner, you're going to shop very differently than if you're shopping for a department meeting, tea time. So depending on the goal, you're going to shop very differently. Similarly with UDL, once you know the goal of the lesson you're working on, maybe the goal is to try to engage, or let's say maybe the goal is to try to engage students in your lecture. You think about the content you want for the lecture, then you can start to be really strategic, like the grocery store, and think about which of these UDL guidelines would be most helpful for that particular learning environment. And you can think about the barriers. You anticipate barriers in your students. Where do they get stuck? Where do you feel like students are coming during office hours and you need to reteach a lot? So let me give you an example. Let's say the goal is to learn the 26 muscles of the human body in an anatomy and physiology class. And the way they do it now is they have students attach rubber band muscles to the skeleton, and they use a worksheet in the book as references. You can already start to anticipate where some of your students will get stuck, what some of the barriers might be. And because you know the goal, you can then start to think about what is just one idea. It doesn't have to be a ton, but what's one option for engagement that you could include? How could you try to recruit interest, for example? What's one option for representation? How could you present the information to students in a couple different ways? Maybe you scaffold the language, or maybe you provide both visual and auditory and video options for them to take a look at. And what could be options for students to show what they know? So for example, students don't necessarily, it's not really important that they attach the muscle model, the rubber bands to the model, because the goal is around learning the muscles. So maybe you could provide a couple options. Students might be able to attach rubber band muscles to the skeleton, or maybe they could use a computer program to learn the muscles, like Quizlet or something like that. Or maybe they could have a paper version plastered up to the wall and they could draw. So there could be options for students to show what they know. So right there, we've implemented UDL. We've thought about a learning goal that we have from our classroom. We've thought about how we currently design that instruction, and we think about the barriers. Where might students get stuck? And we can think about just adding one UDL choice, doesn't have to be a lot, but just add one UDL idea into the design of that environment and make it available for all your students from the beginning. And that is how we implement UDL. And there are some additional slides here for you to think about, how you can, looking closer at options for engagement, options for representation, and options for action and expression. But ideally, you can start to work together to think about how you can really craft the UDL guidelines with your own tools and your own resources, and think about how they're aligning to all of these broad learning networks in the brain. Those affective networks for emotion really matter, as we saw. So when we're designing for emotion, we're thinking about those engagement guidelines of UDL. the strategic networks, the front of the brain, executive function, and our representation networks, our vision, our auditory, tactile. We're thinking about all those different parts of the brain when we're designing with UDL. So the key ideas for today was really, were really to think about what is learning. And I presented 5 ideas that learning is about the interaction of an individual in the environment. We know there's variability. We know there's plasticity. Experience really matters, and emotions are at the core. And given that, hopefully you can then set some clear learning goals and reduce barriers using the UDL guidelines as a tool to help you design just a couple new options into your learning environments to really have all your learners making progress and reaching high expectations for learning. So I invite you to now, pause and reflect. How can you apply this to your practice? I do have a graphic organizer if that's helpful. And thank you so much. I hope that we achieved our goals today and continue to share strategies and next steps. If you have any questions, I'm Allison Posey, aposey@cas.org. I clearly love talking about this stuff and have worked a lot in higher ed. So please feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. Take good care. Thank you. Till learning has no limits. Bye.
Okay, I love Allison when she explains things. She speaks my language for some reason, and I really appreciate that. Okay, so let's